Do you listen to your podcasts with Stitcher? Well, many people like to, and now Notebook on Cities and Culture is available on it. Find out more about what Stitcher is and does at Stitcher.com. It's a smartphone app. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Start off reading a selection from Reyner Banham's immortal Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. He writes about a certain architectural form. It's normally a two-story walk-up apartment block developed back over the full depth of the site, built of wood and stuccoed over. These are the materials that Rudolf Schindler and others used to build the first modern architecture in Los Angeles, and the dingbat, left to its own devices, often exhibits the basic characteristics of a primitive modern architecture. Round the back, away from public gaze, they display simple rectangular forms and flush, smooth surfaces, skinny steel columns and simple boxed balconies, and extensive overhangs to shelter 4 or 5 cars. But at the front, dingbats cannot be left to their own devices. The front is a commercial pitch and a statement about the culture of individualism. A row of dingbats with standardized neat backs and sides will have every street facade competitively individual to the extent that it's hard to believe that similar buildings lie behind. Everything that Nathaniel West said in The Day of the Locust about the fanciful houses in Pinyon Canyon is true of the styles of the dingbats, except they are harder to trace back to historical precedents, every style having been through the Los Angeles mincer. Everything is there: taco burger Aztec, wavy line moderne, cod Cape Cod, gourmet mansardic, Polynesian gabled, and even, in extremity, modern architecture. The dingbat, even more than the occasional tower blocks below Hollywood or along Wilshire, is the true symptom of Los Angeles' urban id, trying to cope with the unprecedented appearance of residential densities too high to be subsumed within the illusions of homestead living. Do you agree?
I could not agree more. That is so. Only wish I was eloquent enough to put it that well. But yeah, completely agree. You know, when I moved here, this was one of the first things I noticed, because we were looking for an apartment and just driving around. I noticed these buildings before I even had much of an interest in them, and I'd read Reyner Banham's wonderful book. So yeah, I agree on everything with that.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down in Santa Monica with Clive Piercy. He's a graphic designer. He is the founder and principal of Air Conditioned, the offices of which we're sitting in right now here in Santa Monica. You'll know his work as well from PhD, the PhD Design Studio. Got his start in England working for the BBC in their television graphics department, and he came here to Los Angeles in the 1980s working for the Rod Dyer Group, designing at least 2 images from the 80s that are iconic to me personally: the poster for Michael Mann's Manhunter and the cover of the solo album Read My Lips by Fee Waybill of the Tubes. So you've created my 1980s in some sense. But he's here because it's the 10th anniversary coming up on of Pretty Vacant, the Los Angeles Dingbat Observed, his photo book on the buildings we've been discussing, the Los Angeles Dingbat. I read Reyner Banham describing it, and you said you've read Reyner Banham. You read him before you came here, did you not? What impression of Los Angeles did you get from being in England, reading this book by an Englishman, the most famous defender of Los Angeles to ever live?
You know, it's slightly more difficult to believe now, but California was so glamorous. I mean, it's so glamorous to most people. I mean, nearly everybody here has come from somewhere else, and I've always been in love with American culture. You know, growing up in England, anything to do with music and style had something to do with America. So, you know, I wanted to escape all of those kind of, you know, English stone buildings. Of course, I love them now. I mean, I could think of nothing nicer. But I was particularly enamored with Los Angeles more than anywhere else, just because of growing up looking at Billy Wilder films, Max Yavno photography. Like I tell everyone, I was surprised it was in color when I got here, and I really wanted it to be the Los Angeles of noir, of Chandler, Nathaniel West, James M. Cain. And when I came here, it was kind of even better than than I thought it would be, and in color too.
What was better? What was different? What's jumped out? Do you remember something jumping out as being that's different than I expected? That's not that wasn't part of my picture. That's striking.
Everything in America is different. You know, you go, look, there's a fire hydrant, you know, because we didn't have them, and cars, you know, the fact that buildings, that the sky, there was so much sky in Los Angeles compared to where I lived. You can't help but be influenced by that, and the light was better, but I knew it would be. I mean, I'd been here a couple of times before I moved here, and so those were really the main things. It smelt of hamburgers, which was great, and donuts, you know, which you don't get in England. It's egg and chips, which is just as good a smell, but it's different. Everything was different, and architecturally, I've always been interested in architecture as a designer, and the thing that it's not really relating to Banham, but the thing that I found so great about Los Angeles was that you can go and see buildings here. You know, the most progressive work are done for houses. It's very uncommon, I think. You know, it's difficult to think of important public buildings in LA. I happen to love the work of Welton Beckett's office, and they really did all the important. They were involved in all of the important public buildings here. If you think about it, from the Pan Pacific Auditorium to the Theme Building to the Capitol Tower. I mean, it's not a public building, but the buildings along Museum Row. They've been incredibly influential, and I think somewhat unheralded. I particularly love that work, that kind of anonymous corporate work that I think is fantastic. And I've lost my thread.
There seems to be a divide among Europeans or Englishmen who come to Los Angeles. Some of them immediately embrace it. To some, it may as well be a hedge maze that's not navigable, not understandable, that cannot be parsed. I don't know if you see that stark divide among your countrymen who come here. I would think you are on the side that immediately embrace it. But what do you think accounts for the differences, or for that kind of spectrum where some can really understand Los Angeles, some it will never happen?
I don't run into many people who come, say, from England, and I mean, unless they can't drive, obviously. I think that there's a kind of freeing thing when you get here. It's still, you know, the purpose of it was to be able to drive through the middle of a city at 70 miles an hour. I mean, there aren't many cities that you can do that because of the freeways, and so you know, there was something really great about that notion. It seemed everything seemed, you know, when I arrived here in 1982, you know, you wouldn't think twice about driving 30 miles to go to dinner, you know. Now it would take you 2-3 hours to get there. So it's changed quite a lot. I mean, my enduring memories of first being here were I bought a big old V8 American car, Thunderbird, 66 Thunderbird, and
probably unavailable in England in any form. Correct?
So I had a Nash Metropolitan in England.
Oh,
so and that thing was crazy. I looked so ridiculous in it. But I also had one here. Anyways, we would drive around in one of my great memories is the free, you know, the how great the freeways were.
What was something wrong with it? What was the state of freeways in England when you left?
Well, they're motorways. You know, we're not very good at glamour, you know. And in an elevated freeway in Los Angeles, with these low buildings and billboards and sun and clarity and the hills in the background. I mean, it's tremendously cinematic.
Did you have the same reaction as Banham did, seeing the 10 meet the 405? Yeah. Is that the one he loves? Yeah. I don't have a car, so I'm talking at least not from direct experience. I do, yes, but I mean,
around on a bike.
Bike, but train. I mean, I live in Koreatown, so there's no pressure to have a car.
Yeah. Well, in 5 years' time, you'll be able to come out here on the train.
That's sooner or later. The big blue bus isn't so bad. I took it here, but even though I don't firsthand use the freeways often, I do look at one of those interchanges and think like Banham. And this is a great work of man. Do you still have that sense, even living here 25 years, much longer than I've lived here, by the way?
No, I don't. I mean, I do. I'm impressed by. I'm impressed in some ways about how good looking some of them are. There are some particularly, as you head out, whatever it's called, the 4 level or something. Those things are pretty.
Stack.
Yeah, they're pretty fantastic, I think, and they look great in Catherine Opie photographs. But I'm somewhat, you can't help driving in LA anymore and not feel somewhat guilty, just because of what it's doing, to everything,
Is there a sense of and our tea has been delivered, so I'll make this a longer question so you can get started on that. And is there a sense of utopian failure with the freeways and the way they don't quite operate? Clearly, they don't operate in the way they were designed or hope to work. And I mean, do you get a sense of a failed utopia from that? And is there one from the dingbats? Because these dingbats seem to have been built in the highest of hopes and are now in. Well, this book is 10 years old, and many of them are falling apart. We're 2013, and many of them don't stand anymore. Some of the ones that do are worse for wear, shall we say?
Well, they were never particular. I mean, they were, from what I can understand, they were built by builders. They weren't by architects. They were essentially a stucco box with something put on the front to make them look good. But I do feel. I mean, I do think there is definitely a feeling of failed utopia. I mean, this kind of city is not sustainable, is it anymore? I mean, I've never been to China, but I don't know how they modeled their new cities or what they modeled their new cities on. But I mean, the thing with them too is that they feel like they should, they all want to have cars. I mean, cars are a tremendously liberating thing. So it's understandable, but I still think it's not sustainable, and that does. It's got to concern you, hasn't it? It has to, just because the amount of whatever it takes to make a road, and have that many cars on it that are not, that are gas guzzlers. You can't help but feel guilty, I don't think. Plus, everywhere in Los Angeles is 20 miles away. That's a short trip. So where I teach, I have to commute 30 miles back and forth, and it's a struggle. Yeah. And then my wife goes in her own car, if she comes back differently. It's not. Yeah, I do feel that if we were starting out on Los Angeles today, it wouldn't look like it does now. Right? Do you agree with that?
I do, but as well, it seems like we're done with the major freeway building in Los Angeles and have been done for a long time. It does seem like the city is undergoing a repurposing. Maybe even the dingbats are being repurposed in some way, if they're not being torn down. I mean, do you see a repurposing in Los Angeles, or is it more of a muddling through, to your mind?
Both, I think. I think that the pervading culture, it's not the right word, but the prevailing thought is to tear something down and put something new up. That, I think, is changing, right? I mean, when I first got there, they say, you should go and see this building. It's really old. It's like 1927. Whereas I was used to seeing buildings from the 1100s. So it's a relative term. And the transient nature of Los Angeles, there's always been that. But there has to be. It's noticeable that there's much more of a conscience about that. Now, dingbats, I love them when they were new looking. I love them when they try to kind of gentrify them. They would take the dingbat light fixtures off and put carriage lamps on them, as though that was going to make any difference.
Just tart them up a bit and hope for the best.
Flash them up a little bit so that they could charge more rent for them. But I'm actually amazed how well they've lasted. You see many streets with them untouched, I would say. I mean, relatively untouched. They get a lick of paint every once in a while.
For listeners who've never done the dingbat tour in Los Angeles, I'm trying to place where they usually are. I mean, Hollywood, West Side. Where do the dingbats tend to survive? Where do you spot them?
Definitely, kind of Montana-ish area. There's a lot around those streets. Koreatown is where there are so many fantastic ones, and I love the ones. It's funny, there are lots where they've been. How can I say that they've been a hint of Oriental flavour? I know Oriental is probably the wrong word. The Asian flavour in them, and they're pretty shabby, I have to say. They definitely are. And then there's a big area through Olympic, south of Olympic in Beverly Hills, where there are different qualities of them. And then Culver City is another area. For this book, I never went to the Valley either, and there's a huge number in the Valley.
Not one of these photos is a Valley dingbat.
I don't think so. I mean, not by choice. They might be. I mean, these, for example, these are all the area codes in which I shot them.
Oh yes, the opening pages.
Yeah. So that was the point of that. So I did, but I didn't do a kind of strenuous journey through the Valley, just because I had enough and I was getting pressed to make this thing. But I subsequently found, hundreds more out there, and they're in good shape out there.
When you first took a photo of a dingbat, was it specifically you wanted to photograph these dingbat things, or was it I'm taking pictures of buildings, I'm taking pictures of Los Angeles, here's something that keeps popping up in my photos?
Both. When we first got here, we would go out on Sunday afternoons in our 66 Thunderbird, my wife and I, taking pictures of buildings that I knew about. The Academy Theatre, for example, the endangered buildings, I guess, and the vernacular buildings. I mean, because they are so different. So the dingbats kind of surreptitiously crept in. It wasn't intentional, but you just see so many of them, and you're forced. We were forced to concentrate because we were looking for apartments too, and a lot of them are apartments. So you'd kind of, you'd see them. You'd see a lot of them. Plus, we were really just discovering. We knew the main arteries, but we didn't drive around. It took us a while to drive around all these neighborhoods, and then you see how great they all are in these, lonely little streets. It's fantastic.
I always think of Hayworth Avenue in West Hollywood for some reason. You have the Hayworth, I believe, in here, but that's kind of a dingbat-rich street, is it not?
Oh, there are lots of streets where nearly that area too. West Hollywood, fantastic. Kings Road, I think, has both sides. Dingbats right and left. And what I used to do, because this was really a side project for me, I would get up on very early in the morning and drive over to a street and shoot all the one side of the street because it was in sun, and then have to come back in the late afternoon, usually golden hour, and shoot the other side.
Oh. Doing this tour early on, looking for apartments, photographing dingbats, having read Reyner Banham, I envision you having moments of talking to native Angelenos, talking about these dingbats, just dropping them into conversation, and locals, natives, saying, "What are you talking about? What's a dingbat? Oh, those things, those pieces of junk. I can't stand it." Did that happen?
Oh yeah, all the time, all the time. I mean, I have to say, I really came here because I loved Ruscha. I loved every building on the Sunset Strip. That was a tremendous influence when I lived in England, having seen that. And the strange thing, and plus he did all his apartment buildings and swimming pools and parking lots and all that. I loved all that stuff. And I realized when I got here, when I first got here, I used to have a wide-angle lens on my camera, and I would try and take these kind of arty architectural photographs. And then they were quite dramatic. And then I've always been a big fan of the English photographer Martin Parr, whose work is a lot about kind of blandness and boredom and everything. And when I got a digital camera, and I saw how I could kind of flatten off these buildings, I fell in love with that. So I went back and retook pictures of most of the ones that I'd already taken, if they still existed, in a much more flat, that's kind of grey. That's the intention for them. And they're all essentially from the driver's side window of my car. That was a point. I mean, I never wanted to make a book out of them. I just wanted to document them, and I love this idea of them being just bland. They're essentially facades, although some of them don't photograph that well that way. So I had some license with it. Plus, if I couldn't get a parking spot or whatever, or there was a car in the front, I'd have to jiggle it around. But they were never anything other than documenting them for my own pleasure.
You mentioned the cars out front, and in many of these head-on photos, probably all of them, you do see a car or two or five parked in the distinctive. I don't necessarily have the terms for the way the carports work in these buildings, but how do you describe it? The way that
not really subterranean, are they?
Yeah, it's not underground parking. You see the cars parked under the building because one of the units overhangs the parking. You probably have better words than I do for this.
Well, I don't have better words than that, but I do know that those were the ones that were the most intriguing, only because they reminded me, as I've said before, there's a little bit of some of the very best ones do have a kind of international style to them. They're quite pure. Maybe that's because they couldn't afford to do any more on it, but I like the restrained ones the best. And there are some absolute gems, beautiful ones, quite stylish in some. If they'd been in the middle of a field like the Glass House, I think they would get some credibility.
Location.
Yeah. Oh, I would tell you also about people not knowing what dingbats are. Once I started taking pictures, you stand outside someone's house for a while taking pictures, and they get curious, And there's the area of West Hollywood, I would say, I might be wrong on the number here, but the majority, 75%, are Russian, East Europeans living in them.
Yes.
So I'd be taking pictures, and invariably someone would come out, usually in their pajamas or a dressing gown, and ask me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm taking a picture of your place." "Why?" "Well, I find them architecturally significant. I really like them." Their eyes would almost always light up. And then they would say, "Are you interested in buying the building?" That would be their first question. And then they would say, "Are you allowed to take pictures?" And my response was always, and it was a little clipped, but it was always like, the reason both you and I live in this country is so that I can come by your house and take a picture of it.
Yes, exactly. And I would have
that usually shut him up, I must say.
I feel that in America, but I never would have had the words for it having been born here. It takes an outsider.
Absolutely.
Banham, you, or I was a few months ago on this show in Santa Monica interviewing your countrywoman Frances Anderton, who does design and architecture at KCRW, and we talked about, I forget if they were her words or my words, but how Southern Californians who were born here don't appreciate getting out of the crushing burden of history that there can be in English. She grew up in a very, very old town, even by Britain's standards. But do you agree with the crushing burden?
Absolutely. Now it's not a burden, but when I was young, it was. Undoubtedly, yeah.
Talking about the cars a bit, it brings to mind the cars you see under these dingbats. They're cheap cars. They're cheap cars in the way the buildings are cheap, not built to last. And you mentioned in the introduction of this book, it always pains me to read the name. I think it's the Kia Aspire. You see Aspire. Oh God. I gather you are someone who appreciates fine automobiles, appreciates the craft of automobiles, or the design of automobiles, wants to drive a well-made automobile, and as do I, which is why I don't own a car, because I'd rather no car than the Aspires of the world. So. Does either the cheapness of these buildings or the cheapness of the cars underneath, the flimsiness, shall we say, does it sadden you at all? I think it saddens me a little bit that there's this proliferation of junk, I guess. A dingbat built to last would be even better to my mind than a dingbat that isn't.
Absolutely. It is. They're sad characters, these buildings. They are. And they, I mentioned before, Nathaniel West, I believe that, if the Day of the Locust was set post-Second World War, everyone would live in dingbats. They would, rather than Spanish-style little apartment, those lovely little apartment warrens that the Day of the Locust is set in. They'd all live in dingbats, yeah. It's, apartment living's kind of a struggle anyway. And, Yeah, I do think that. And the cars, they're mostly crappy cars. And the whole thing has this ephemeral, transient, That's why it's called Pretty Vacant. I find their vacantness pretty.
We both appreciate that these dingbats are here, but I should underscore the fact neither of us have ever lived in one, right? I mean, did you get stories that they're bad to live in? Or I don't know many people who have.
Friends. I mean, a lot of people have said, I live in that particular building, or I live in a dingbat, and you didn't take that picture. And no one ever really loves living in them. They're not big enough, really. They don't have enough light in them, too, I don't think, because the front onto the street, the streets are much busier now than they were when they were constructed, I think. There's a lot more cars, there's a lot more, even all the trees have grown. Everything's got kind of more dense. And they've probably become real, everyone's got TV and a boombox, and the walls are, paper thin. I'm sure they're, and there's, they probably don't conduct heat very well and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm sure it's kind of miserable.
Doing graphic design in England, did you find you were inspired by influences from across the pond and that made you want to come here? Or did you want to come here to be infused with California design?
Both. I mean, the two great influences, the two things that made me want to be a graphic designer, first of all, Sgt. Pepper's album cover,
of course.
Peter Blake's wonderful cover, which is full of American imagery, and Milton Glaser, the greatest American graphic designer of the 20th century, his covers for the New Oxford Shakespeare series, both I knew I had to come to this country once I'd seen that work.
What was it? Was the design freer? Was it a different set of cultural influences? What did you think? Just specific, not even what was going on. What did you think was going on?
Well, Black American soul music, Levi's and Fruit of the Loom T-shirts. You couldn't get those in England. Basswegians. So style with a capital S for sure. Movies. It's a tremendously glamorous place to want to come to. Being the right, Thatcher was. I really hated Margaret Thatcher. I ended up coming here and got Reagan instead. But nevertheless, I think I always say that there's the inherent difference between England and America, Britain and America, is that British people are inherently negative and American people are inherently positive. And there's pluses and minuses to both. But in America, if someone's doing well, somebody else looks at it and says, I could do that. Whereas in Britain, if someone's doing well, they go, oh, look at him, jumped up, above his station. Resentment, yeah. So there's an inherent difference. There's this absolute basic difference. You can get a little fed up with everyone thinking they're going to be the next great star in America too. So that drives me nuts. But that's really the difference, I think. That's the fundamental difference that I've experienced.
Now, I mentioned at the beginning, you came to Los Angeles working for the Raw Dyer Group in the 80s, and I mentioned some iconic personal 80s images that you worked on, the Manhunter poster, the Read My Lips cover, and you came here to Los Angeles, coastal Los Angeles in the 80s, which is such a still resonant moment for people, for Americans. Like, if they think of the 80s, they probably think of aesthetics to come out of Los Angeles at that time, and those two images, those still look tasteful to me, tasteful representations of the 80s. Much now seems not tasteful that came out of the 1980s. But tell me, what are your memories of that sort of the richest points of that 1980s Los Angeles design and aesthetics?
The first assignment I got from Rod Dyer was to redesign the identity for the Shangri-La Hotel on Ocean Avenue here, the most beautiful 30s building. I thought I was in the Art Deco building. I mean, it was like paradise. It was a heavenly job. Wow. It was absolutely incredible job. So there was that. And then we worked on a lot of retail things, restaurants, stores, galleries and things. And it was that kind of pastel colours and ripped paper look, that I was really good at. I'd plundered that for years. And then we got the assignment to work on the Olympic program in 84, and I got put on this big newspaper assignment that came out every day during the Olympics. It was a fantastic project. But it all had to do with Deborah Sussman's iconic festive federalism design program, that kind of faux postmodern thing. And, for the 2 weeks that it was up during the Olympics, Los Angeles looked fantastic, really fantastic. Plus everyone cleared out. They were petrified that there was going to be a, terrorist attack, and it was amazing.
What I heard, traffic was very good in that time. It was the year I was born, so I didn't get to experience it directly, but I hear the traffic was excellent.
It was fantastic, and these doom and gloom things about the freeways just jamming up and everyone leaving their cars and everything. None of it happened. It was great, but so that the city looked amazing. But what the unfortunate result of all of that is that style of kind of cheesy postmodern columns with a ball on the top and a pink triangle got co-opted for every single mini mall that was built subsequently. Do you agree? I mean,
you still see the resonances in Los Angeles, West Hollywood, and Santa Monica most specifically, I would say.
There'll be a chicken on fire, a yogurt shop, a dry cleaners, and a check cashing, place, all done in this horrible, I mean, the style of postmodernism is so easy to co-opt, but it's so easy to get all the proportions wrong. It needs to be proportioned right. If there's any connection to Memphis and Sotsas and all of that, they did it properly. Whereas, again, the same people that built my dingbat buildings built these mini malls, and they just threw them up and painted them pastel colors, pink and lime green and violet and light blue.
They didn't care. They just said, people take this.
They looked a temporary improvement, which is, I think, one of the problems with Los Angeles is that people settle for a temporary improvement. Not quite the case anymore, but you know what I mean. Certainly in shopping centers.
Do you miss anything about the dominant aesthetics of the 1980s in Los Angeles?
Ooh. Not the music. I'm not a big, not fan of 80s music particularly. Film was good then. I think. Maybe not. Breakfast Club and all that terrible stuff. No, maybe not. I mean, the 80s, it was so exciting to be here in the 80s. Because we were younger than I am now. So everywhere seems, you always say, oh, it was great back then. In the 80s, people were saying, oh, it was great back then about the 50s. And the people in the 50s were saying, oh, it was great back then about the 30s. It's just because you were younger.
You don't miss then, you miss who you were then.
I think that's what it is. I do. And I was also, when I was talking about Ruscha, his pictures, I realized, his pictures have no degree of nostalgia to them. Mine have a somewhat nostalgic, because the buildings are old. He took pictures of apartment buildings when they were new. And I'm not really nostalgic for the era of the pictures. I'm nostalgic for the era for Ruscha. It's a subtle, so I'm not trying, I don't find them nostalgic in any way. I find them stylish, that's what I like about them, and that's to do with Ruscha. I think I have the same appreciation as he does. Plus, I love his work.
Ruscha, he's been as valuable a guide to Los Angeles as Banham has been for me. But, Ruscha will say things that make you think that he doesn't care about Los Angeles, doesn't care about anything here, could have done this anywhere, this is just stuff he's painting. I don't know if I believe him. Do you believe him?
Yeah, I believe him.
Oh, yes?
Yeah, I do. I do. Only because he's a maverick in some way, and he's a free spirit, and I love that. I love that about him. Artists, don't really need particularly to feel as much a sense of place, I don't think, because they get everything from their work. I mean, he's slightly different, I admit, but no, I don't think he and Banham need to be compared. They're both great.
Although listeners, you can see them interact in, there's a BBC special, Reyner Banham Loves Los Angeles from 1970. Oh, you've seen that?
Yes, you can see it on YouTube, can't you?
Yes.
I've actually seen little bits of it. I've never seen it all the way through. I stopped halfway through. It's great, though. It's great. I'm a big fan of Ian Nairn. Do you know Ian Nairn in London?
I've heard the name, but I guess both me and the listeners need an introduction.
Well, the same way that Banham brought a very spirited, very clever kind of warts and all appreciation of high and low. It's high and low, really. That's one of the things I'm most interested in. Ian Nairn, the great writer he's Scots, but in London did a TV program called Nairn's London that was so fantastic, where he would pay as much attention to a roundabout as, you know, a concrete roundabout as a church. And that was incredibly liberating for me to recognize that, coupled with I'm a big fan of the writer Clive James, who, you know, his travel writing is fantastic. And he came here. And
have you read from Los Angeles pieces? Yes, I was read them often, actually.
Oh, it's fantastic.
He's been on this show, and that was sort of a. He tends to steamroll you when you talk, but I was glad to have him because what you're describing.
Quite so much now. He has emphysema, I think, now. Doesn't he?
This was a few years ago.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely major influence. He's the person I would most like to sound like.
I think everybody wants to sound like Clive James.
Yeah.
Clive James wants to sound like Clive James, I think.
Yeah. I mean, he's fantastic. His postcard from Los Angeles is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Even though it seems like it's its mission to make fun of it, it's still genuine observations come through.
Absolutely. I think he has his predisposition is to be sarcastic, but he's able to pick out the great moments. I mean, I think, you know, how can you not enjoy driving in a convertible car in a sunny day along PCH, you know?
One day I've got to do it.
Oh, right. Well, you'd be hitchhiking along PCH, yeah. So that's Clive James. I'm just, I guess it's that not demystifying, but it's downplaying the critical analysis that I really like. I don't like particularly lofty writing. And Clive James is so smart that he doesn't have to show off in that way. I didn't put that very well, but
no, you did. I mean, because you bring to mind. I think of Clive James on Los Angeles. I think of Jan Morris on Los Angeles. I think of Richard Reyner on Los Angeles. Christopher Isherwood on Los Angeles. David Hockney on Los Angeles. The British Empire has produced some very astute minds on Los Angeles. I mean, throw Banham's name there in again.
And filmmakers too. Obviously, you know, there was big expat community in Hollywood from the beginnings of Hollywood. You know, I don't know if you can consider Chaplin English, but you know what I mean.
Close enough.
Yeah, close enough. Yeah, Raymond Chandler was English, born in England, but yeah, no, I agree totally. I mean, it's true that you, as you said earlier on, it's easy for Americans to forget what they've got here. Whereas if you've come from somewhere else, you have a clearer eye on it. Most people do. I mean, you know, Hockney is the definitive Los Angeles artist, right?
I mean, he made it to the cover of, well, this particular cover of Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Colleges, which I said I bought because it was the dumbest cover design of them all. But
dumbest typography.
Yes, the painting I like.
Yeah,
but
yeah, that's 80s typography.
Yes, listeners, this is a Pelican edition, mid 80s, with Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. The A is that sort of anarchy circled A. Well, the less said about this, the better. High and low. A friend comes to visit you in Los Angeles. What's a place you take them to see high and low together? Just any place you would take them to see that.
I take a lot of people to the Adamson House. You've been there? At Malibu Lagoon. I love that place. Driving around, we go down, you know, downtown used to be the old Coca-Cola bottling plant. We used to do architectural tours where, again, these buildings kind of benefit from being seen on the move, I think. So driving is the best way to see to see the architecture downtown. I've always loved Geary's Temporary Contemporary, what's called the Geffen Contemporary now. Love going to see that place. That seems to me the perfect embodiment of, and it was, when it was done, it was, I think, really radical to just kind of leave that kind of space essentially alone, just tarted up enough for it to look intentional. And I've never seen a bad exhibit in that building. It just has the volume. You can see Richard Serra's Talked Ellipses in there, or what's his name, the Japanese Murakami show. There was a show of there was a great case studies show there in the 80s where they actually recreated some of the life's actual size recreations of some of the rooms and things. It was fantastic. It was great. I used to love driving along Miracle Mile, and you were taken back to a lot of the great vernacular things. There was a building shaped like a camera, and then there was one like an ice cream cone, and all of that. I loved all of that next to very glamorous, modern, expensive tower blocks.
I've only been here a couple of years, but I was born in California. Oh yes, I mean, well, that's it's more complicated than that, I guess. It's part of the substance of the question. I mean, I was born in California, the other half, albeit the different northern half, and I've only been here a couple of years, but I've been concerned the whole way through with staying an outsider in Los Angeles so that I can appreciate it as much as I can be an outsider. And having been born in England, do you feel you need to work to stay an outsider, or are you never subsumable into?
I think it's impossible. It doesn't engender that kind of loyalty, I don't think.
But I like that. The anti-loyalty here is no other city has it.
It's true. No other city has it. And cities, by definition, I think, are places where you come to be somewhat more anonymous than a little village where everybody knows everything. I mean, that can feel incredibly kind of restricting, right? Especially when you're young. You just want to get out of that. I remember when I moved from... I grew up in the Cotswolds, a very, very tiny little village. And when I went to art school in Brighton, and Brighton seemed like it was like Las Vegas compared to Cheltenham, where I grew up, a Regency town. Brighton was another Regency town, but it had that kind of Londoners' day out thing, and it seemed the places were open till midnight. It was. I thought it was so glamorous to be somewhere where you were a bit more anonymous. I think that's what most cities are like, aren't they? You go there so that you can carve out your own kind of life.
I recall you saying in another interview something you tell your graphic design students, emphasized early, that this profession doesn't need you. And Los Angeles seems like it broadcasts it doesn't need you here, which I like about it. Is that it's just like, yeah, you can come here. You'll be in Angelina the moment you set foot in the city. We don't need you. That sounds harsh, but I like that element of it. I don't quite know why. And do you think that is an element of this city?
It definitely is. I mean, it helps that the sun's shining when they tell you that
yes,
too.
True.
Do you know what I mean? If it was belting with rain, if it looked like Blade Runner, I don't think there'd be that many people still living here. But I do agree with that. I do tell my students that too. Yeah. I also tell them they're not going to get a job. But that's another story.
Everybody under a certain age has accepted they're not going to get a job as defined in previous generations, right?
Absolutely. It's ridiculous. When I was at school, it was just it was never even considered. There were jobs.
Is that so? I've heard in England, at least in the 70s, students were getting told, well, don't expect work.
Well, it's probably true. I mean, it's probably true. I mean, I was, I was pretty good. I got a job at the BBC. Before I left college, I was tapped by them, which was great. So I never really had to look for a job. In fact, I've never had to look for a job. But I don't know I mean, it's how good you are. I mean, all of my good students get work, and all the bad ones do something else.
I'm going to critique an earlier question of mine. I asked you if you missed the aesthetics of the 80s, and I wonder if actually all aesthetics are now available. Is there a dominant aesthetic now, or is it just, do we have it all at our fingertips?
We do. I mean, I'm a product of modernism. Most people of my generation who are designers in some way have grown up and worked with the tenets of modernism. I work in a beautiful, and I went to teach at Art Centre purely because of that wonderful Craig Aylward building, which he calls a skyscraper lying on its side, a beautiful hillside campus. But I think that I look at the students that come today and they don't have a connection to modernism particularly. I think it's more decorationism.
Decorationism?
It's a new word, sorry.
We need a definition.
Well, I'm not sure I have a definition, but that's what I've noticed, that they are bombarded with so much stuff, all of which is given equal credibility. That's what worries me. My students are incredibly good at downloading images. They have no idea where they came from. They have excellent taste in it. And then the struggle is they don't literally know where it's come from, so they have no understanding why it's good or bad. They just have a good eye on things. They have kind of excellent taste, but really it's a struggle to get them then to ground their work in ideas.
Some of these students may have been born in, 1992? Yeah. The web hit in 1993? Yeah. They're the same age as it. Absolutely.
It's just as easy to download a picture of a Piero della Francesca painting as it is SpongeBob SquarePants image. And that's what I see. That now that high and low, that bashing together of things, sometimes delivers really good work. But also, a lot of students now, the majority of students where I teach have come from another country. Essentially, most of them come from Asia. And so their observations of Los Angeles are not grounded in the same, I would say, romantic associations that I had. Los Angeles must have been an incredible place here in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? Just before up until the Second World War, it must have been incredibly, because it was licensed to do anything. And I think architecturally, that's why you see a Tudor house next to a Spanish style house next to a modernist house. That's what's fantastic. Everybody kind of, plus it's on the edge of something. It's a frontier. It's on the edge of something. And that also engenders the spirit of frontiersmen, of freedom, I think, right?
Do you think Los Angeles' license to do anything has been revoked or limited since then?
Revoked. That's a really, I like that. Revoked. I agree. I think it's been revoked.
When did this happen? When did they take it away?
Probably O.J. Simpson.
So mid-90s. You can no longer do whatever you please in Los Angeles. We're locking down.
Something, more than one thing died when O.J. Simpson, killed. Do you know what I mean? I suppose. Going back through history, all of those, Black Dahlia stuff, all of that. There have been terrible things that have. But in my experience here, that seemed to be a tremendously negative impact on the city. Plus, I only have to say one word: Bush.
I imagine OJ having more of a local effect than Bush, though. What was the palpable difference in the city pre-post OJ?
I just think that. It's coincidental. It might not literally be because of that, but that sense of optimism. Is that obviously, as we said before, some of that comes from being younger, right? Younger then. Right. So now you're a little more jaded or a little more skeptical. I don't know. That seemed to me to be a thing that people lost a lot of faith's not the word, but good feelings about the place because of that, I think.
These
Nothing good came out of that. Nothing good came out of that.
Indeed, I don't think anybody would argue to the contrary there. Yeah. These students you mentioned, these young students from Asia, very good at downloading, are they not bringing in some optimism to replenish the place, or is it something else they bring in that is non-optimistic?
Well, they are, the thing that I notice most about them, the thing they're most interested in, branding. They love brands. Young people from Asia are incredibly sophisticated in their kind of brand knowledge. Now, I find that, maybe that's only the equivalent of me being interested in Levi's and soul music and all of that. I mean, it's tribal, Music and fashion used to go together in tribes, and I'm always depressed at how electronic music, much as I like it, has kind of made people's look generic. It's hoodies and hoodies and t-shirts and trainers,
Sure.
And I think something's been lost from that. And I find that my students, they don't look like art students. They look like business trainees, all buttoned up. And I used to go to college wearing pajamas. I looked like an idiot. But something about the self-expression was important. And I would say that culturally they're more buttoned up. They're straighter, and it takes quite a lot to kind of not necessarily break them down, but open them up more to start recognizing the things inside of them that are important to them. They're mostly formulaic until they start to see what an art school education can do for them.
Do they not seem to understand, seem to accept that their work can come from their own personality? Like, is that illegal in their minds until you tell them it isn't?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a revelation to them to watch that light bulb go off over their heads sometimes.
Why don't they think that's okay?
I think it's this is I'm not sure if this is culturalist or not, but they're closed off. They're definitely closed off. And to your point, I don't think very many of them like being in Los Angeles yet, I would say. Yet. I think it takes a certain kind of license with yourself to enjoy it.
It's just to them a place they landed.
It is. It's a place they land. It's a place to which their parents have made them get an education. I think.
What do they dislike resent about the city? Can you tell? Is it just this sort of amorphous, like, I don't know about this place?
Well, I think the scale of it is one thing, no doubt. I mean, I would say that this. It's obviously it's difficult if English is your second language to come and kind of understand all the nuances of a place. I think. Me being English coming here, I think I had actually an advantage, because people all think you're descended from royalty if you're English,
Right. I think you're smarter than them also. Absolutely. That definitely helps.
Absolutely. Whereas I think that coupled with a kind of shy resolve, that they struggle with that.
Can you get these kids excited about dingbats?
I've tried.
What happens?
Not particularly about those buildings. I don't find that many design students interested in architecture, unfortunately.
The domains that people would think were fairly close in terms of appreciation, they don't even care? Design, architecture might as well be on two different continents?
Absolutely. And even photography and architectural photography. I love the photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto, who went to Art Center and did a beautiful series of modernist buildings, all shot out of focus. They're transcendently fantastic. And I think that you have to know what that building's about to love that picture. But my students don't seem to be interested in that. I mean, we talk a lot about film. My history class, so-called history class, history of design, is all about the intersection of fashion, film, painting, writing, sport, music. And film, I can talk to them about Hitchcock and say, it's great because Cary Grant's in it, and they have no idea why they don't know who Cary Grant is. They just know he looks like something. and I think in order to really appreciate, one of the great things about film, in this case, is knowing the history of that man who then came to play this role in this film with Hitchcock. That's what
context.
Context, exactly, totally. They seem to be. They don't seem to be interested in that.
Context, is the element you also need to appreciate Los Angeles, isn't it? People don't kind of bother with that sometimes.
They rarely bother with it. But a lot of image makers do. Filmmakers, painters, designers, photographers. Everybody likes taking pictures out here. It's difficult to you can point a camera pretty much anywhere around here, and it can look great, apart from those 80s mini malls. But that's
even those. There's a photo book in those 80s mini malls, is there not?
There definitely is. Yeah. I've always wanted to do those kind of those not necessarily McMansions, but how people from the Middle East have come to Beverly Hills and tarted up those already exist. Do you know what I mean? There's such a confluence of architectural styles with one more thing added onto it. I think they're fantastic.
They're palimpsest in the way that a dingbat is, isn't it? Where it's like they built one thing, it got aged, they added a new thing onto it. Is that a word suitable for both of those types of residences?
Maybe. I don't see as much layering on a dingbat building. There's precious little to work with.
There's only so much.
I love the fact that they call them, the Lord Byron or something.
We haven't even mentioned the names, Polynesian or royal names, names of the streets put together to sound even grander.
Yeah. The Lord Byron, as if Lord Byron would ever live in a dump like that,
The gloves are off now, a dump like that, huh?
Well, you know what I mean.
Yes. Could a dingbat be built today? Is that even envisionable? What is a dingbat in 2013? What's 2013's dingbat? Is there one? Does that question make sense?
I haven't ever considered that prospect. Presumably, codes were codes more relaxed in those days. I just think you couldn't build something of that scale that bad, not necessarily badly, I guess cheaply. Would that be the word? They now would be. I guess it would be. The equivalent might be affordable housing, right?
It could be, but that's not as conspicuous. They're even less conspicuous than dingbats, which were not that conspicuous.
No, they weren't. But I think they. The lovely thing about them is the differing degrees of the way they want to show off a little bit. They're actually quite restrained, and they're quite shy, I think, a lot of these buildings. I'm not sure that they were all ever, originally painted lime green and with pink trim and all, like some of them have got to. I think they were fairly restrained. And then for some reason they would make either the name or the numbers on the building outrageously out of scale with them.
Bothersome as a typographer to see the scale problems there, right?
Of course. That's high and low right there. No, it's fantastic. And even better when, half of that number fell off into the street and they never replaced it, or I have a friend whose company's called Number 17 after the film, and I have a beautiful, wooden script 17, but the S has fallen off. So it's even teen. It's, could not get any better than that. It's so beautiful.
Finally, does anything in the Los Angeles built environment still fuel you in your work? If not identifiably in the built environment, and anything about Los Angeles you can point to and say that is still driving what I create in some sense. After over 25 years here, it's tough to identify that. But over 30 years here. I
still think that as I meant to say first of all, is that the names of Neutra, Elwood, Wright, Lautner, Soriano, all the case study architects. It's still radical work, and you can see it here. It's not behind, not in a museum. You can actually see the buildings and how they have survived, adapted, I mean, I'm not particularly. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in being preserved in time. No building needs to be that. I mean, I think there's this ongoing question. I think with the Eames house, whether or not they leave it, whether or not they want to put it back to the day it was built, or they just want it to kind of, they want the patina to be important. And I when done properly, I would vote for the latter.
And in the case of a dingbat?
Well, they'll never, they not the word deserve. They don't really warrant upgrading in any way. They're never going to be better than they were originally. I mean, it would look silly to tart them up even more. But I do like them. I do like them when they've been. I still like the crappy ones that are falling apart, and I sometimes like the new ones, the more kitschy, gentrified ones, where they've spruced them up a little bit. But they nearly all look better in black and white photography than they do in color. Something
just the way you originally envisioned Los Angeles, black and white.
Absolutely.
I've been speaking here in the Santa Monica offices of Air Conditioned with graphic designer Clive Piercy. He is the author of the book coming up on its 10th anniversary, Pretty Vacant, the Los Angeles Dingbat Observed. And of course he did that Manhunter poster and that Fee Waybill album cover that I so enjoyed. He's just walked around the corner, but I'll lean over and say, Clive, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Clive.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall, and you can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Nolman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.